Cuba, and you can see that as to how they link that. And then when they were talking about both Cubans and Puerto Ricans, when talking about Dominican cuisine, I started realizing this, I don't know, okay, Dominican cuisine is not that good. And the first thing was the breakfast. And it's something that, again, I mentioned before, that Dominicans know it's something unique about them. But then the way we, and I said we, Puerto Ricans and Cubans spoke about it was something as, oh my God, do you know they eat mango for breakfast? That's something that's bad. And in a sense, it was tied more to times of poverty and agriculture, where people had to wake up at 5 in the morning and work in the field. So you start seeing some interesting social distinctions in how they spoke about mango and eating plantains in breakfast. And then you also see from this Cuban informant, and you see that she is hesitant to say it. Dominican cuisine, I hate to say it like this, don't judge me too harshly, but when I say stews, I think of it's like scraps. So they felt a little bit hesitant, but still they saw Dominican cuisine as something that was not that good. However, the interesting thing is that even though the Puerto Ricans were making these connections to the Cubans through the cuisine, it wasn't reciprocated. So again, as I mentioned before, Cubans were like, I don't know anything about Puerto Rican cuisine. And then when they were talking about Puerto Rican cuisine, a lot of them had a similar discourse, and also using plantain. And plantain, even though I have these two images here, one of them is Plátano Power, and if you're with the recent baseball tournament, there was this thing about Plátano Power when Dominican Republic was playing. Like it is used as a sign of national pride, and you see here this piece by artist Miguel Luciano talking about the cultural importance of plantain, yet when people speak about it, there is this notion of plantain being something from poverty. And this is something that, if you look into the history of the cuisine, when plantains were first introduced into our diets, they were introduced in order to feed the slaves. And there was this notion of plantain being a plant that you just put there, that it doesn't require a lot of work, so it was also tied to poverty and laziness from some of those historical records. So again, it's interesting to see that Puerto Ricans use plantains to differentiate from Dominicans, and then Cubans do the same to us. So it's that interesting hierarchy that I started finding here. And then another thing, I don't think it's here, that both of them spoke, mostly Cubans spoke about, is that we Puerto Ricans, we do eat a lot of fried food. And that's, yeah, I actually wrote another paper separate about that. The last piece I wanted to share with you is, sorry, my notes are kind of mixed up, is the relative importance of these cuisines in daily lives. So despite the closeness and similarities I saw in these cuisines, traditional meals, Cuban, Puerto Rican cuisines, these are tied to our national identities. It's part of a lot of who we are. And these traditional practices, food practices, play an important role, especially in immigrant and ethnic communities, that again, being able to consume, cook, prepare this food allows people to maintain a link from home, even if this link is not physical. Even if you are not able to travel, you're able to travel through your palate. And this notion, I think it's widely accepted when we look at migration and food literature, but still I always like to question these assumptions. So I ask people, how important is it for you to eat this cuisine? Again, how important is Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Dominican cuisine for you? And a lot of the responses that you can see here were in line with that literature. You see people saying it is very important, it is tied to our history. first informants started talking about the Taino Indians, all of that, so food was very important in that sense. For informants that had children, it was very important that their children ate the same foods that they ate growing up. And then it was interesting when some of my informants had a big event in their life. For example, this one here was moving to Australia. And she was saying how the first, as you see here, the first thing I did was not look at the cost of living, the prices. The first thing I told my husband is, I'm sorry about the typo, can I find Goya foods there? So it was that important. And then you see other cases that this last one here, this Dominican woman, that she said that since she converted to Islam, she was unable to maintain ties, for example, through music, partying, but food was something that, of course, without pork, that she was able to pass along to her children. However, while these experiences were, again, very in line to what we see in the literature, it was not the case for everyone. And interestingly, this is something I want to discuss with you in a few minutes, this was not the case for a lot of the Cuban informants. In general, I don't present a lot of that here, but in general, Cubans spoke about their foods as being a cuisine that is very limited, not sophisticated, very unhealthy. And this, as you see here, it relates to how they didn't see Cuban food as important in their lives. And this trend was also seen throughout the interviews where, for example, I was having dinner with one of them, and they say, oh, I'm going to order wine. That's not very Cuban of me. Or I don't eat rice every day. So it's through their food choices they were saying, I'm not that Cuban because I don't eat this food all the time. So I found that really interesting, that distancing of that identity through the food. And I think, one of the things I'm trying to do with this work is linking up how these informants speak about their foods to, of course, their migration histories. For example, when you see the other quotes from the Puerto Rican and Dominican informants, there was an attachment still with the country and memories, positive memories back home. And one of my working theories that I would love to talk with you is that a lot of the Cuban informants, even when I asked them, have you been back to Cuba? Are you interested in going back? There was a complete detachment from the Cuba of now that they cannot go to or that they're not interested in going to. And again, this is interestingly reflected in how they speak about their food. Again, this was not all Cubans. I did have one Puerto Rican informant that he said that Puerto Rican food wasn't that important to him, even though he did eat it often, but he liked to eat other things. So some of the takeaway messages is, again, that interesting difference in importance of cuisine, that Cuban detachment versus the Puerto Rican and Dominican maintenance of the cuisine. Also the differences within similarities, that hierarchy that I feel start appearing when we looked at how they speak about the other foods, and some of it linkages between how they get here and the desire to continue being linked to a culture or not when they're here. Thank you. And these here, I'm looking forward to your questions, but I did wanted to share the link of my blog if you're interested in knowing more about this research as it goes, and these are some of the published articles if you want to read more about this. Thank you. Any questions?
Let me start by mentioning that a lot of what you presented reminded me of a very old article by Virginia Dominguez. I don't know if you've come across it, from the 1970s, and it's based on interviews with Dominicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans in Washington Heights. At the time, in the 1970s, the proportion of those three groups was roughly similar. It became overwhelmingly Dominican later, but at that time there were quite a few Cubans, quite a lot of Puerto Ricans, And what was interesting about the article, and I think it has to do with what you're talking about, is this hierarchy, a racial hierarchy. Because the main finding was that these three groups saw each other, Dominicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans, they all agreed the Cubans were white, that the Dominicans were black, and the Puerto Ricans were somewhere in between, were mulattoes or mestizos. And even though the actual proportions of black, white, and mulattoes in that neighborhood was actually very similar, that's the stereotype that they had. So they would relate to each other, in public at least, in parks, in schools. They didn't really marry with each other at that time. So I think race may be something to take into consideration. You know, this idea that Cubans are whiter and that Dominicans are not, and that plantain especially is connected to race. I don't know, that's something to think about.
Yes.
You live in New York, or you studied in New York?
I'm sorry?
I'm wondering, in New York, because I've been to New York, but it's usually just for the touristing, not to live and actually experience it. Like here is both, you see a lot of Cuban restaurants, very little Puerto Rican, and less Dominican. In New York, what is the proportion, or is there a big, comparing the three countries, what would you say they're more Puerto Rican restaurant versus Dominican versus Cuban?
I actually have a visual for that.
Yeah.
It's something that I didn't include here, but I looked into. And the visual is, let me see where, bear with me, here. So it's, originally I did an analysis like this, comparing Cuban and Puerto Rican restaurants and looking into the big disparity because we do have a lot of Puerto Ricans, but not a lot of restaurants. But here, this answers your question.
So there's more Dominican restaurants than anything else.
Yes, so Dominicans are, have a lot of restaurants, and not only in the restaurant industry, but they're also moving into the bodegas, and so they have taken a lot of that food sector.
Interesting.
But still, you do have a lot of Cuban restaurants. And
very,
something,
very little Puerto Rican.
yeah, especially if you look at the other pie that
Right.
Puerto Ricans we make, I mean, I'm not arguing, I think there should be some balance, but you see that we have a lot of Puerto Ricans, very few Cubans, and then you see that. And the interesting thing with the Cuban restaurants is that not all of them, but a lot of them are non-Cubans that use the cuisine to do a business.
Oh, really? So it's really not your traditional Cuban food that they may call it Cuban, but it may not be the experience they will get here at a Versailles or.
No, there is one that's very old. It's called Victor's Cafe. I think at one point they tried opening one here, but I don't know if that happened or not. But aside from that, it's American, U.S. born chefs that. There's one that I found very interesting that's called Havana Central. They have a couple of Havana or something. And the food is Mexican. And they do that because they base the restaurant on this legend or some encounter that Che Guevara had in a bar in Mexico City. So they use the Cuban Revolution or the pre-revolution Cuba as a way to sell the cuisine. Very, very interesting.
And would you say that the reason for that is that because the Puerto Ricans there have been there for so long that they've lost touch with that part of their culture? Or would you say it's more because of economic reasons that there's less Puerto Rican restaurants now than Dominican restaurants? What's your guess?
I've been asking that question, and people, I say I don't know. There's some ideas. For example, I feel immigrants, they can use food as a source of income. It's very, you open a restaurant, you don't need to have a lot of education. So some Cuban and Dominicans are able to use that as a source of income. There is, and whereas Puerto Ricans, I say this with a little bit of hesitancy, because we do have access to safety nets, that some people say, well, if you have a safety net to fall, that you don't fall into poverty, you might not have that drive to do a business. I think these are things that we need to study further. Another thing that people had said, if I looked at city guides from 1939 on, and there was a time in the 1970s around that there were a lot, maybe not so much more, but there were more Puerto Rican restaurants and sit-down nice restaurants, but they started closing. And some people say that either the sons or daughters of the restaurateurs don't want to follow because they were educated, so they go into other things, or also the displacement of the community through rents, through even burning of areas to move these communities out. So I've been asking this question a lot, and recently in East Harlem we have this institution called El Museo del Barrio, which historically has been Puerto Rican, but now is switching to Latino. And I went recently, and they opened a restaurant. It was a Mexican restaurant. And my question was like, why? I mean, I love Mexican cuisine, don't get me wrong, but why not a Puerto Rican restaurant? And I started asking that question, and people didn't know the answer, but I'll try to get to the bottom of that.
As we move into multiculturalism and the blending, I also noticed, at least here in Miami, the combination, the fusion of restaurants, Puerto Ricans and Cubans, or Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and others. Is that what you see also as an upcoming trend, or can you talk about it?
Yes, especially like that earlier Cuban man said, there's a lot of intermarriage, so you do see, and also the use of Spanish food is used in New York, and I don't know if here is the case too, to say this blanket term for Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Dominican food. So you do see that Spanish use. And something I wanted, in the future I would love to do something similar here in Miami, because when I lived here, I want to say 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I was able to get my food through Cuban restaurants. But now it's interesting that you go to traditional Cuban restaurants and you might see things like mofongo, or things that are traditionally Puerto Rican that were not here when I lived here. And I think it's related to, you see my mom here, so Puerto Ricans are moving here, and in that sense, opening more Puerto Rican restaurants. Yes?
Where do you put the Puerto Rican restaurants that are now so-called gourmet restaurant? Like there's a restaurant in Boston that you know, that it's a young couple that opened this restaurant, and they're both architects, but they live off this gourmet restaurant, and it's supposed to be Puerto Rican food in a way where it's, you don't go there for rice and beans. You go there for a gourmet way of preparing Puerto Rican food. There is a small town in Vermont that's called Woodstock, Vermont. And my daughter that lives close, she lives in Boston, but anyway, we go there often. And she said, let's go and have dinner at this Puerto Rican restaurant that opened in Woodstock, Vermont. And I said, well, what kind of food? Oh, no, it's gourmet food. You're not going to go and eat mofongo there. This is a gourmet Puerto Rican restaurant. Now, I see more and more of that variation of Puerto Rican food, where it's going into the gourmet restaurant type. Does that fall within the Puerto Rican restaurant cuisine, or they're out of that category?
They do, and something that I find very interesting is that those things are not found in New York City. So if you go to the finest Puerto Rican restaurant in New York City, there's a sister restaurant group. They have one called Sofrito and Sazon. Rice, a lot of rice and gandules, pigeon peas. Rice, pigeon peas, and pork is what you get in New York City. Whereas if you go outside of to Boston, DC, there's one called Meal where famous chefs from Puerto Rico go and do interesting things. You go back to Puerto Rico and the cuisine there has escalated in amazing ways. But in New York, it's like frozen in time. In the 1950s, 60s, whatever they brought in their imagination, that's where it stayed. There is now this young man that he's doing something interesting but with mofongo, that he's selling a fancy food truck where people pay $10, $12 for a small mofongo. I wouldn't pay that, but I'm really happy to see non-Puerto Ricans doing that. So there's little things like that, but that gourmet hasn't reached the New York City still.
You brought something interesting, is the value that a Puerto Rican or a Cuban, I'm from Puerto Rico, and I remember many years ago, this restaurant is not in place anymore, but Ricky Martin, he got a restaurant right on Ocean Drive, and it was called Salsa. And it was a combination, he wanted to at least go into that gourmet area, but many of the, at least the Puerto Rican community would not go and pay $7 for an alcapurria, like that.
Yeah.
So that's something I think for ethnic restaurants, sometimes the value that I guess the native of the culture will be willing to pay, how come I'm gonna pay $10 for rice and beans? But then you pay $10 for, I don't know, Chinese rice or something. It has to do with knowing your culture and the value that you will put to how you will pay for that.
Yeah, and there was, I was part of this community meeting in New York City. I forget the name of that. There was an initiative coming from Puerto Rico that they wanted to talk to the different diaspora communities, and I was part of this group, culinary something, artist, something like that. And in that conversation, the Puerto Rican community was saying, oh, we don't have Puerto Rican restaurants here. And I'm like, wait a second, what about this, and that? And they started talking about exactly that. Oh, we don't go to these restaurants. They will pay for rice and beans, frijoles negros, but they will not go and eat at a Puerto Rican restaurant. So that was an interesting conversation where they realized, oh, wait, what's wrong with us that we're doing this and we don't go and sponsor our own restaurants. I mean, there's a sense, well, I can cook it at home.
By the way, thank you for coming and presenting. It's been a very interesting presentation. I've got a question for you. How easy is it for the lay family to go to a supermarket to obtain Hispanic products? Like here, for example, you have Publix, which in Dixie, which are the key supermarket, but you also have Sedano's and the Pasto Presidente. And it's pretty much all throughout Miami. You go a little bit north to West Palm Beach, you're going to find that even at the Publix, they don't carry Hispanic products. How easy is it in New York City to go to any supermarket and find Hispanic products to cook?
Very easy.
Very easy?
Yes, and that is, if you look at the other migration and food literature, a lot of it is concentrated in that and how people navigate their foodscape, so-called, in order to get the rice, the beans, but it's fairly easy. Because again, the story of the community there, we had markets that before they were from Jewish and Italian immigrants, and they were taken over by Puerto Ricans, now Dominicans. So I'm able to get avocado, not as good as the one I can find in Puerto Rico, but I'm able to get it. Plantains, even actually cheaper than in Puerto Rico.
And
So
yuca too, yuca?
yes, anything. So it's something that at least and I ask all of these and I stop asking the question because I can get whatever.
But in New York, most Latinos don't shop at the big supermarket because they have to walk there. So it's the bodegas, no, that are really the
Yeah.
things supply.
Yeah, the bodegas, but still in areas like East Harlem, they do have big supermarkets, Latino, yeah. And in the bodegas, yeah, you can find plantains, yuca, yeah, and the beans, the rice. It's fairly easy. In Boston, I lived there before. You could still find it, but it wasn't sometimes the right rice or things like that.
Do you have any thoughts on Orlando, the emerging food market in Orlando?
I do. I wish I had more money and time because there is and it's interesting, something that you've written about, the movement of businesses to the U.S., like in Maison, I think it's here.
Yes.
So it's interesting to see how we are changing. We are moves the local foodscape. And as I mentioned before, we're slowly invading alongside the Cuban restaurants. I think you will see more Puerto Rican restaurants.
And I think in that sense, it might be also a class situation, huh? With more middle class professional Puerto Rican moving to Orlando. Maybe they do have the money to pay for more expensive food, and they do want to eat mofongo and traditional food. So there's so many Puerto Rican restaurants in Orlando.
Yeah, I haven't been there recently, but yes, I'm sure there are a lot.
In Puerto Rico is mofongo? They say mofongo or
Yep.
is in Santo Domingo?
That is a tricky question. When I started doing this work, in my mind it was, okay, we eat mofongo, Dominicans eat mango, and Cubans you have fufu. So that was my plantain division. But then when I started interviewing Dominicans, one Dominican said, mofongo is very Dominican. I'm like, what? And I stopped a little bit because it's something I'm looking into because again, in my mind I had this division. It seems that mofongo is also, some version of it is Dominican, even though I don't like to admit it, because we want to have our
No,
foods.
because when I go to Santo Domingo, they have a lot of mofongo.
Yes, that's something in the beginning I started asking. I went to Puerto Rico and spoke with some Dominicans there, and some Dominicans say, no, mofongo is Puerto Rican, and I mean, I don't know if it's because the comings and goings of the population, until I was able to look into a cookbook from the 1960s where they had mofongo. So I was like, okay. But it's a different version. Some, they might not fry it, they might boil it, but still use the chicharrón and the garlic.
Yeah.
And another difference is that when we do the stuffed mofongo, I don't know if you've had it, is the pilón. And then in Puerto Rico, we have the hole in the middle where you put shrimp, anything like that inside. Whereas the equivalent in Dominican, the ones I've seen, is that they match everything together. So instead of having that hole, you have the plantain mixed with the chicken or... But I'm going to Dominican Republic in May.
The food is good.
So it's something I'm planning on looking into. Yes.
I'm not Dominican food from Santo Domingo, but I know because I was there many times and the food is very good.
No, I mean, it's very good flavor, definitely.
In Puerto Rico, looking for the best mofongo on the island is like a hobby. Everybody's into it. And then you'll hear somebody say, I went to such and such a restaurant in Adjuntas, that's 3 hours from San Juan, and it's the best mofongo, and somebody will say, that's not mofongo, that's Dominican mofongo. It's not the real thing. And the thing is that one is boiled plantain and the other one is fried. And but it's almost like a hobby. Even here, they'll say, oh, I found a Puerto Rican restaurant down in Kendall, the best mofongo ever. You know? It's like a hobby. It's something that everybody's into it.
Can you say something about the nutritional value? Because I know you worked on that and how people talk about it and what you think is in terms of, health aspect.
Yes, so another, because again, I'm in public health nutrition, so I do have to talk about that. I did ask people, I didn't present it here, but I did ask people to talk about their diets in terms of health. And a lot of people said, people were divided into camps. Some people said, no, it's unhealthy, it's the worst food ever. Some people were Dominicans, a lot of them said it's healthy, it's balanced. You have your rice, your beans, and your meat, that's a balanced meal. And then a lot of, some people stayed in the middle saying, well, it depends how you cook it. It depends if you have a mountain of rice versus a little bit. And then there are things that we recognize, for example, as I mentioned before, the prevalence of fried food in Puerto Rican cuisine. I wrote that paper, I think it was there, it's called We Like Fried Things. And it's actually comparing how all the three of us talk about fried food. Another thing that is people spoke about that is definitely true is that we don't eat a lot of salad. If we eat a salad, I think it's this iceberg lettuce, maybe a pale tomato, and avocado is our vegetable. A lot of people said that. And I recently completed interviews with nutritionists that work with this community and asked them the same question. I asked them if they had tried the food, how they view it in terms of health. And of course they said, well, it's very unhealthy. Some people, and I didn't ask the questions myself. I had a research assistant, this US born girl, so they were free to talk whatever they wanted about my food. And some of them were saying, well, I've tried it, I don't know what's the big deal, it's not that good. So I'm analyzing those right now. But still there is a lot of agreement between the things we see as unhealthy and the things that they see as unhealthy. One interesting thing is, I mentioned a little bit about it before, is that some informants, I think, some of the Puerto Ricans were a little bit of the older of the sample. So this idea that our food was healthier before, and when we lived in the countryside, it was healthier before. And with the nutritionists, something that I'm starting to find is that they said that our food is very unprocessed and natural. So there's also this idea that, again, we live in the countryside and that we have this natural food, and it's that when we moved here that our lives are ruined because we started eating all of this junk food. Well, we do see, unfortunately, a lot of diabetes. Some people said it's really hard to not know someone that has diabetes or hypertension, high cholesterol. Yeah, so unfortunately that's the case.
With this new trend of delivery services like Blue Apron, HelloFresh, how do you see